Today we are discussing phonetics. Of course, as you know, there is a difference between phonetics and phonology. In phonetics, we discuss the external features of speech sounds in the sense that the articulatory features, the acoustic features, and also the auditory features. The articulatory features are related to the processes or sound production. The acoustic features are related to the process of sound transmission, and the auditory features are related to the process of sound reception. So these are the three things involved in the production of speech and also its reception. Now we are skipping that part and then we are moving on to the classification of speech sounds. So we have already discussed, we have already seen that there is a basic classification, a fundamental classification in which all the speech sounds are classified into vowels and consonants. As you know, vowels are the sounds that are produced with a free flow of the airstream. Consonants are the sounds that are produced with a restricted flow of the airstream. That is to say, when consonant sounds are produced, the airflow is restricted or constricted at different places using your speech organs. So in order to make this classification, you should have some criteria. And the first criterion is the nature of the airstream. So in the case of all languages, English and also the Indian languages, the airstream mechanism is pulmonic egressive, that we have already seen. So that is why we are not considering it at present, because this particular airstream is common to all the Indian languages as well as English. And the second one is the state of the glottis. The glottis has two states. One is, depending on the position of the vocal cords, you can say either the glottis is closed or open. So when the vocal cords are held apart, when they are apart, the glottis is considered to be closed, and when they are held together, the glottis is closed. So when you produce a speech sound with the glottis open, then voiceless sounds are produced. And when you produce sounds with the glottis closed, voiced sounds are produced. So in short, we can say that the function of the glottis is to decide whether a sound is voiceless or voiced. So therefore, we are taking it as one of the important criteria for the classification of consonants. The third one is the articulators, in which you have two subdivisions. You consider articulators, the speech organs, the entire speech organs, and you consider two aspects. One is the places of articulation, and the second is the manners of articulation. With regard to the places of articulation, so you can say that when you make a speech sound, articulators come together to produce speech sounds. For example, in the production of the sound p, there are two articulators. One is the active articulator and the other one is the passive articulator. These two articulators come together to make a contact first. then the context is suddenly released and the sound is created. That is the example of the sound p. When you produce that, there are two articulators. One is the lower lip and the other one is the upper lip. They come together, blocking the airstream. Then immediately, all of a sudden, the block is released. Then the sound, the airstream goes out with an explosion. So therefore, you call it a plosive sound. So this is an example of, the criterion of place of articulation. So place of articulation refers to the place where the articulation takes place. And the next important criterion is the manner of articulation. Manner of articulation refers to the manner in which articulation takes place. That is, the place of articulation is the where of articulation, and manner of articulation is the how of articulation. Where does the articulation take place and how is it taking place? So these are the questions, these are the considerations in place of articulation and manner of articulation. So this manner of articulation is also known as the nature of stricture. Stricture in the sense that stricture is the way in which the articulators come together to make a closure. So that is what is stricture. So all these criteria can be probably shortlisted into three important criteria. They are the state of the glottis, place of articulation, and manner of articulation. On the basis of these three criteria, we give sounds three-term labels, three-term descriptions. For example, p is a voiceless, bilabial, plosive. Depending on the nature of the glottis, you call it a voiceless sound. Then depending on the place of articulation, you call it a bilabial sound because two lips are involved. That is why you call it a bilabial sound. Then depending on the manner of articulation, you say that it is a plosive because plosion takes place in the production of this sound. So accordingly, you can consider some of the places of articulation, and we can make a movement from front to back. First, we shall begin with the first place of articulation, that is bilabial. Bilabial in the sense that articulators are two lips. The lower lip is the active articulator and the upper lip is the passive articulator. What is the difference between passive and active articulators? Active articulator plays a more active role in the process of articulation. The lower lip is the active articulator because that is the articulator that moves. Considering that, we consider it as the active articulator. And the upper lip, of course, that is the passive articulator. So there are, three plosive sounds in English that we shall look at later on. So now you have to understand that the first place of articulation is bilabial. Now we shall move on to the second one, that is labiodental. As the name indicates, you know that there are two articulators. The active articulator is the lower lip and the passive articulator is the upper front teeth. So that is why you call it labiodental. Okay. Now the next one, because we are moving from front to back. So in your mouth, the first part, that is the bilabial place, and the second one is the labiodental place. Labiodental, I shall also give you one example, that is the sound f, as in fan, which is articulated with the place of articulation as labiodental. Then the third one is dental. Dental in the sense that the articulation takes place just behind the upper front teeth. The tip of the tongue makes a firm contact with the upper front teeth. If the contact is firm, possibly you know that then the plosive sounds are produced on release. But in the case of an English sound, English labiodental sounds, for example, th in the word thin, the initial sound of the word thin or thank you, that is a fricative sound, that is not a plosive sound, because there is no plosion there. But the Indian speakers usually use a plosive dental sound in place of the British fricative dental sound, because we are not familiar with the original pronunciation of that particular sound. Anyway, that we shall consider at a later time. Here, the next position is alveolar. In the alveolar articulation, there is an alveolar ridge just behind your upper front teeth. This is also called alveolum technically, the alveolar or teeth ridge, alveolar ridge, and the tip of the tongue makes a contact with the alveolum, and certain sounds are produced using different types of strictures over there. Considering the place of articulation, such sounds are known as the alveolar sounds. Then behind alveolum, you have the hard palate, and when you use the hard palate as your place of articulation, then you produce palatal sounds. Then behind hard palate, you have the soft palate, and when you use the soft palate as a place of articulation, the sounds are known as velar place. Velar is also the soft palate. So these are the major places of articulation by which English sounds are produced. And of course, there are some other places too which are not relevant to our discussion, because English sounds are not produced that way. For example, the uvular. Uvular is also a place of articulation, and there is no uvular sound in English. And besides these places of articulation, there are also combination sounds like labio-velar articulation, as in the case of V, which is represented by our letter W, because we don't really make a distinction between west and west. These are two different words. One is W-E-S-T, west, and the other one is V-E-S-T, west. These are two different sounds. They have two different pronunciations, but normally the Indian speakers don't make a distinction between them. So the V sound in water, west, etc., that particular sound is a labio-velar sound. It is considered to be a labio-velar sound. While discussing stricture, you can consider that too. That is, they are also known as semi-vowels. There are certain sounds which are also known as semi-vowels. Then it is now right and proper to also talk about the last criterion that we discussed, that is the stricture involved. There are many strictures. The most important one is the first one. Perhaps you cannot say that that is the most important one. All the strictures are important. The first one is the stricture of complete closure and sudden release. As it is described, you know that there is production of the airstream and the airstream is blocked at some place in your mouth, in your oral cavity, with the help of some of the organs of speech. The airstream is blocked completely. So therefore you say that the closure is complete. So after this complete closure, if there is a sudden release, then you say that stops are produced. Stops or plosives, they are also known as plosives. But truly speaking, they are not the same. Stops, when you say, it is a more general term. Or stops, all stops are not plosives. The distinction is this. The stops made with a pulmonic egressive airstream are called plosives. So, for example, our sound per sound in pen, etc. So that is a plosive considering the stricture. What is the stricture involved? The two lips come together and they make a firm contact and they block the airstream completely. Then all of a sudden there is a release. When the release is sudden, naturally the air goes out with an explosion. Because plosion is involved, you call it a plosive. So that is a kind of stricture. And the second one is the stricture of complete closure and slow release. Here there is only one minor difference. The other things are the same, but instead of a sudden release, the release is slow. There is a complete closure, of course, but after the closure, instead of making a plosion, an explosive release, you just have a very slow release. For example, the sound ch in church, j in judge, the initial sound. So in the production of that sound, what happens? The process is the same. The articulators come together, they make a firm closure, but instead of a sudden release, there is a very slow release. This stricture is known as the stricture of complete closure and slow release. The sounds produced this way are called affricates. If a sound is produced with a stricture of complete closure and sudden release, they are called plosives. And if it is produced with a complete closure and slow release, they are called affricates. Okay. Now the third one is fricatives. In the case of fricatives, there is no complete closure. That is the most distinguishing feature. The articulators come very close to each other. They come very close to each other, leaving a very narrow gap between them. So as a result, what happens? The airstream comes and it goes out with an audible friction. So the sounds, such sounds generate friction. Therefore, such friction generating sounds are known as fricatives. So earlier I said, the sound, the initial sound of the word sin or then or thank you, that is a fricative in English, but in Indian English it is realized as a plosive. Difference is this: when it is a fricative, there is no complete blocking. The airstream passes, but not without difficulty, with an audible friction. So therefore, such friction generating sounds are known as fricatives. Okay, now in the next stricture is complete stricture of complete oral closure. A structure of complete oral closure. In this kind of a structure, what happens is there are two passages. One is the oral passage and the other one is the nasal passage. In the production of different types of speech sounds, we manipulate both these oral and nasal passages. In this kind of structure, that is structure of complete oral closure, what you do is, the articulators come together and block the oral passage completely. But at the same time, the soft palate is lowered and the nasal passage is open. The soft palate has two positions. One is the raised position and the other one is the lowered position. When the soft palate is raised, the nasal passage is blocked. It is closed. The air cannot escape through the nose then. But when the soft palate is lowered, the nasal passage is open, but at the same time, the oral passage is not completely closed. So the oral closure is always affected by the coming together of the articulators. So when you produce a sound, your articulators come together, they make a firm contact and the oral passage is closed, and at the same time, if you keep the nasal passage open by lowering the soft palate, what happens? The nasal sounds are produced. The airstream will go out through your nose. As a result, the nasal sounds are produced. The next structure is the structure of intermittent closure. In the structure of intermittent closure, the articulators don't make a firm contact. They make continuous repeated contact. That is to say, they strike against each other. For example, the sound R, that is an example for a sound produced with a structure of intermittent closure. But once again, that is the kind of R sound that we make is different from the original British sound. The original British sound, that is a frictionless continuant. It is not produced by this kind of a structure. But this sound is very frequent in our languages, Indian languages, etc. So when you produce a sound, when these two articulators frequently and continuously make contact, frequent contacts, then there is a kind of special sound. R sound is produced in the case of R, sound R, and similarly in the case of other speech sounds, corresponding sounds are produced. That is not a typical English sound. Then the next one, the structure of open approximation. In the structure of open approximation, there is no contact at all, and the air can almost pass freely between the articulators. They are similar to the vowel sounds. You know that the particularity of vowel sounds is that the airflow is free and unrestricted. There are two types of sounds in English. One is the frictionless continuant and the other one is semi-vowels. Semi-vowels because they are vowel-like in their articulation. They are almost vowel-like in their articulation. For example, the initial sound of the word water, well, you can say that the first sound is almost vowel-like. In fact, it sounds a diphthong, u and e. So you can say that actually, if you actually look at the nature of that particular sound, it is almost like a vowel articulation. But there is another reason why you consider it as a consonant that I'll discuss in some other class. So that is an example for a semivowel. Another semivowel in English is the ya sound. Ya, ya. Ya as in yes, yet, year. Year is a typical word where you always leave out that semivowel sound. Instead of that, you replace with the pure vowel sound. Instead of year, you say ear. Instead of yes, you say s. So that is a particular quality of Indian English. Once again, we need to say that that particular sound too is not actually used in Indian English, but that is a British sound. So with that, we can probably sum up the discussion of the classification of the consonants. Thank you very much.